The crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom did not merely illuminate the space. It wept light, casting thousands of fractured, brilliant diamonds across the polished marble floor like stardust spilled by a careless god. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of tuberose and aged cognac, a heady cocktail of privilege and pretense. Laughter cascaded like champagne bubbles, ringing against the gold leaf molding. While the elite of Manhattan moved with the practiced grace of predators, their designer fabrics whispering secrets against one another. To any observer, this was a masterpiece of social theater, yet I, Sloan, existed within it as a dissonance, a single jarring note in a symphony meant to celebrate only the divine. Today marked the zenith of the sterling Apex Group's ambition, the signing of a $400 million commercial real estate contract. It was a figure that commanded oxygen, a sum that could build empires or bury cities. For Vance Sterling, my husband and the CEO whose charisma was as sharp as his tailored Tom Ford lapels, this was his coronation. He stood at the heart of the ballroom, his silhouette framed by the adoration of his father and the vultures of high finance. He was radiant, a lighthouse around which the social tides turned. Yet, in the 3 years of our hollow marriage, I had learned that the light he projected never reached the corners where I stood. I was the shadow that refused to vanish. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was the architect of this coldness. As she glided through the crowd, her deep crimson Oscar de la Renta gown flowing behind her like a trail of spilled wine, she moved with the glacial authority of a queen. She didn't just walk. She occupied space, and she ensured I was squeezed out of it. When her gaze briefly flickered over me, it carried the weight of a physical blow. A silent command to remain invisible, a superfluous ornament that had long since lost its luster. I had spent 3 years mastering the art of the ghost. The solitary pouring of sparkling water, the retreat into velvet-draped alcoves, the forced, brittle smile beneath the predatory curiosity of Manhattan's socialites. They stared at me, at my simple, unadorned dress, and then at Vance, their eyes brimming with the unspoken cruel question. Why her? I had once believed that virtue and quiet devotion were currencies that could buy a seat at the table of love. I was wrong. Love, I realized, was not a reward for merit. It was a fickle whim, as cruel as the people who traded in it. The evening reached its grotesque crescendo, a moment that tore the veil of my endurance to shreds. Vance moved through the throng, his hand locked with that of another. She was Cleo, a runway siren whose emerald sweetheart gown clung to her frame like a second skin, accentuating the vibrant, dangerous life I had suppressed in myself. Vance led her to the center of the room, his movements fluid and unburdened by shame. He didn't just introduce her. He presented her like a trophy, a masterpiece finally unveiled. "Let me introduce you all," he announced, his voice ringing with a terrifying absolute clarity. "This is Cleo, my soulmate." The room inhaled in a collective gasp of salacious anticipation. A few polite claps rippled through the air, mocking the very foundations of my existence. Eleanor stood nearby, her expression not one of shock, but of profound, sickening satisfaction. She beamed at Cleo with an affection she had never once deigned to offer me, a public endorsement of my erasure. My heart, long accustomed to neglect, suddenly seized as if caught in a rusted vice. Soulmate? If she were the truth of his heart, then what was I? Was I merely the legal fiction, the architect who had surrendered her blueprints to build his house, only to be locked out of the front door? Was I the silence that endured his Soho dinners, the ghost haunting the halls of a marriage that had already rotted from within? The indignation was no longer a dull ache, it was a searing fire. I could feel the heat rising behind my eyes, the tears of 1,000 nights manifesting as a cold, dangerous resolve. I did not scream. I did not weep. I simply stepped into the spotlight, my feet feeling as light as the decision I had just made. I stood directly in front of him, my shadow falling over Cleo, my voice a blade cutting through the orchestral swell. Vance, could you explain this a bit? Isn't your wife still standing right here? The room died. The jazz quartet's melody faltered and decayed into a discordant screech. Every pair of eyes turned toward us, gorging on the sight of my public defiance. Vance recoiled, his face flushing with the indignity of being held accountable. He physically detached Cleo's arm, his eyes darting toward the judging crowd, his voice dropping to a panicked, venomous hiss. Sloan, don't. I don't make a scene here. We can talk when we get back to the penthouse. The mention of the penthouse, that gilded cage where I had suffered in solitude, hit me with the force of a final realization. I stared at him, watching the mask of the charismatic CEO crack to reveal the weak, panicked man beneath. I turned my head, my gaze shifting away from him and toward the woman who had spent the last hour watching me with the cold detachment of a predator waiting for the kill, the chairwoman of the partner conglomerate. I held her gaze, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the frozen ballroom like a death knell. Mother, let them taste bankruptcy. The woman's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock crossing her features before she stiffened, for she knew exactly what I meant, that the power in this room had never really belonged to Vance, but to the woman whose daughter he had so carelessly discarded, and now the house of cards was about to be swept away by the wind of my. Cleo stood beside him, her lips curled into a smirk so insolent it felt like a physical affront. She looked at me not with the wariness of a mistress, but with the condescending pity one reserves for a stray animal that has wandered too far into a sanctuary. She measured my worth by the fraying edges of my pride and found me wanting. Yet, the crescendo of this tragedy was not orchestrated by my husband's cowardice. It was unleashed by the cold, calculating hand of my mother-in-law. Eleanor stepped into the space between us, her face, a masterpiece of surgical precision and expensive creams, hardening into the jagged authoritarian lines of an inquisitor. Before I could process the malice radiating from her, she moved. Her hand swung through the air in a blur of silk and cruelty. A dry, sickening slap echoed against the gilded walls, effectively suffocating the melodic jazz and silencing the room into a tomb-like stillness. One side of my face erupted in a searing rhythmic fire, the pain radiating deep into my jawbone, grounding me in the reality of my own insignificance to them. I heard the collective intake of breath from the Wall Street elite, a chorus of shock that tasted of copper and bile. My hair, pinned with the desperate precision of a woman trying to appear worthy of a name that was never truly hers, cascaded down in disarray. Wisps of dark silk clung to my burning cheek, masking the raw exposure of my shame. I did not cry. To weep would have been a luxury I could not afford, a concession to the vultures circling above. But beneath the ribs, I felt the structural integrity of my spirit snapping like brittle glass. Get lost, Eleanor hissed, the words cutting through the tension with the clinical, antiseptic sharpness of a surgical scalpel. Stop being an eyesore to me, you ungrateful little nobody. The silence that followed was the most deafening sound of my life. No one spoke. No one stirred. My husband, the man to whom I had tethered my youth, for whom I had hollowed out my own ambitions and sacrificed the better part of 3 years, stood paralyzed. He looked at me, then flicked his gaze toward his mother, his expression a pathetic, frantic ledger, calculating which alliance promised a more comfortable existence. I scanned the room, meeting the eyes of the city's power brokers. I saw pity, yes, but I also saw the ravenous curiosity of spectators at a coliseum, and worse, the gloating of those who relished the sight of a social climber losing her grip on the cliff face. Amidst hundreds of the most influential, wealthy, and powerful people on the planet, I felt a desolation so absolute it bordered on the metaphysical. The physical sting on my face was a trifle. The real injury was the realization that in their grand design, I was not a participant nor even a person. I was a decorative ornament that had failed to match the decor. To them, my demand for dignity was an aesthetic crime. I slowly straightened my spine, the movement measured and deliberate, My hand rose to touch my burning cheek, the skin throbbing beneath my fingertips. I did not look at Vance, nor did I grant Eleanor the satisfaction of a glare. Instead, I pulled my lips into a smile, a strange, gentle, and utterly terrifying curvature of the mouth. It was a phantom expression, one that did not belong to the woman who had just been shattered. It was the smile of someone who had suddenly realized the game was rigged and had decided to burn the table. Eleanor recoiled as if stung, and the triumph in Cleo's eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden jagged blade of panic. I turned, and every step of my stilettos clicked against the polished marble floor like the rhythmic counting of a funeral march. I did not retreat toward the Fifth Avenue exit. I set my sights on the VIP dais, where the titans of industry sat upon their pedestals. The room swayed, eyes tracking my path, a sea of confused, hungry gazes. Eleanor recovered enough to bark. "Where do you think you're going? Leave immediately." I ignored her. My destination was fixed, my purpose crystallized. The woman at the center of the table was a study in monochromatic power. Her hair pulled back into a sleek, imposing chignon, draped in a vintage black Dior dress that commanded the air around her. She was Margot Kensington, the chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings, the unseen architect behind the $400 million development that served as the heartbeat of Sterling Apex. She had been a silent sphinx all evening, watching the theater of my humiliation with eyes that saw everything but yielded nothing. I stopped at her side. The ballroom held its breath, the air so thin it became difficult to inhale. Behind me, the tectonic plates of my marriage shifted. I heard the frantic, whispered confusion of Vance and Eleanor, their voices high and trembling. I leaned down, my hair acting as a curtain to hide the sudden, fierce light in my eyes. Then, in the hollowed-out silence of the room, I spoke. The word fell like an anvil from the heavens, "Mother." The effect was seismic. At the VIP table, the titans froze, wine glasses suspended in midair. Vance stood anchored to the spot, his face drained of blood, his grip failing until the crystal flute slipped from his fingers, shattering into 1,000 shards that mirrored the wreckage of his arrogance. Eleanor's jaw slackened, her eyes wide with a burgeoning horrific comprehension. A frantic murmur rippled through the hall, a swarm of bees disturbed in the dark. Margot shifted, lifting her head to look at me. In the depths of those cold, sharp eyes, a flicker of profound heartbreak collided with a storm of lethal fury. She did not speak, but she gave a single imperceptible nod, a silent coronation of my truth. I leaned closer still, my voice a whisper that carried the sub-zero chill of a coming winter, a sound so sharp it made the executives nearby recoil. "Let them taste bankruptcy." I straightened my frame, my posture iron-willed. Margot Kensington, my mother, maintained a mask of total composure, yet the twitch of her hand was a command. She signaled the chief of staff hovering in the shadows, who immediately sprinted toward the stage and took the microphone from the bewildered host with a mechanical, almost predatory efficiency. The man stood tall, a portrait of corporate indifference, his presence commanding the silence of the room. His voice, stripped of all preamble, rang out clear, cold, and utterly resolute, slicing through the tension like a guillotine blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings, Margot Kensington, I would like to make an urgent announcement. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we have officially decided to withdraw from the Sterling Apex Urban Redevelopment Project. All previous agreements and letters of intent are hereby void. Thank you and good evening." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a brief statement, barely a handful of sentences, yet its destructive power possessed the force of an atmospheric collapse, far greater than 1,000 venomous insults. The entire grand hall was shaken to its foundations. A collective gasp rippled through the elite assembly like wine through dry reeds. $400 million. The dream that had fueled the entire Sterling dynasty for a generation. The crown jewel of the Apex project had shattered into wisps of smoke in a single merciless moment. I watched, detached and hollow, as my father-in-law, Richard Sterling, stumbled, his complexion turning a sickly, translucent gray as he clutched the edge of a mahogany table to keep from collapsing. Across the room, Vance stood paralyzed, his face drained of blood, looking at me with an expression of absolute primal horror. A man watching his world incinerate before his eyes. And then there was Eleanor, the woman who mere minutes ago had shrieked "Get lost" at my face, her voice dripping with venom. Now she was a trembling wreck, pointing a manicured finger at me, her mouth opening and closing in a series of incoherent, stuttering gasps. The pride had been violently stripped from her. She rushed toward my mother, her expertly contoured face now twisted into a mask of grotesque panic. She tried to force a strained, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes, her voice quivering and stripped of all the upper-crust authority she had wielded like a weapon. "Margot, what nonsense is this girl saying? She's not right in the head. Probably just having a nervous breakdown from the stress of it all. We are all family. Whatever it is, let's just step into a private suite and talk it out like civilized people." I found the spectacle utterly laughable. A dark comedy playing out on a stage of wreckage. Just moments before, she had treated me like a repulsive disease, a stain upon her golden lineage. Now, facing the abyss of financial ruin, she hastily claimed the sanctity of family. My mother merely glanced at Eleanor, her eyes as glacial and unforgiving as a New York winter. She did not bother to respond, dismissing her existence with a terrifying silence. Instead, she turned to look at me, her gaze softening into a calm that was simultaneously a shield and a sword. A fierce, unwavering protection. "My daughter, I understand. As for my son-in-law, today I have finally seen his true colors." That sentence contained no profanity, no raised voice, but it hit the air with the weight of an executioner's gavel. It was an invisible backhand, striking squarely across Vance's and his entire family's faces. It was both a final affirmation of our bond and a clinical corporate death sentence. Only then did Vance seem to wake from his catatonic trance. He looked at me, his eyes no longer shimmering with the cold, haughty disdain I had grown accustomed to, but filled with a raw, bubbling terror. He rushed toward me, oblivious to the stares of hundreds of Manhattan's elite, and suddenly collapsed, dropping to his knees at my feet. The very hands that wore a limited edition Patek Philippe, the hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts with the arrogance of a king, were now pathetically clutching at the fabric of my skirt. "Sloan, I beg you, let's stop this. Everything is just a terrible misunderstanding. Cleo and I are nothing, just business colleagues. Please don't be angry. Don't do this, Sloan." His voice was choked with frantic, ugly sobs, genuine tears of greed and fear welling in his eyes. I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet, the man I had once believed was the center of my universe, the man I had loved with a blinding, naive devotion. Now I felt nothing but a cold, acidic tide of disgust rising within me. Who was he performing this pathetic act for? For me or for my mother, the billionaire holding the jagged shards of his legacy in her hands? Why didn't he show this fragility when he introduced that woman as his soulmate? Why didn't he find his voice when his mother slapped me in front of the world? With a deliberate, steady motion, I detached his trembling hands from my dress and took a slow step back, physically distancing myself from his desperation. I looked straight into his weeping eyes, my voice as chillingly composed as my mother's gaze. "Vance, stand up. You are a truly terrible actor in this sad little play. You should save these desperate words for your soulmate." I purposely emphasized the word soulmate, watching the realization hit home, causing Cleo, who had been frozen in the periphery, to turn a few shades paler until she looked like a ghost. I didn't want to stay in this suffocating poison place a second longer. I turned to my mother and gave a slight, affirming nod. My mother stood up, draped her cashmere wrap over her shoulders with regal grace, and walked away with me. We moved through the crowd, which parted instinctively like the Red Sea, past the amazed, curious, and panicked eyes of Vance's family. I didn't look back, but I could still hear Vance's desperate, guttural cries and Eleanor's frantic, bird-like screams echoing off the marble pillars, a cacophony of lost power. But all those sounds to me now were nothing more than the hollow echoes of a dead past. The Maybach glided through the Manhattan night, leaving behind the magnificent, deceptive facade of the plaza and the unfinished tragic comedy. The street lights flashed past the tinted windows, casting streaks of light and shadow on my face, rhythmic pulses of amber and cold blue that flickered like the fading memories of my life with Vance. Outside, the city was a sprawling, neon-drenched beast, a cacophony of sirens and hurried footsteps that never seemed to find peace. Yet inside the cavernous silence of the Maybach, the stillness was so profound it felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums like the weight of a submerged world. My mother sat motionless, her silhouette a pillar of regal composure. Yet she didn't probe, didn't demand explanations, didn't lecture. She simply reached out and enveloped my trembling hand in hers, a touch that was warm, steady, and achingly familiar. That single point of contact shattered the fortress of stoicism I had spent years constructing around my brittle heart. The walls crumbled, stone by agonizing stone, and the tears I had suppressed through years of indignity finally broke their dam. They were not tears of humiliation or weakness, but the cathartic release of a daughter who had finally found the safe, inviolable harbor she had abandoned for a mirage. The car did not veer toward the cramped, drafty walk-up in Astoria, Queens, that suffocating shoebox where I had spent 2 years of my life shrinking myself to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. Instead, it glided toward the Upper East Side, drawing to a graceful halt before the historic limestone townhouse that had stood as my sanctuary for generations, shielded from the vulgarity of the world by towering wrought iron gates. As I stepped over the threshold, the air was heavy with the scent of fresh hydrangeas and the faint, nostalgic tang of beeswax polish, a scent that acted as a balm to my fractured soul. Everything remained exactly as I had left it. The uncompromising lines of contemporary art in the foyer, the plush cream sectionals, the stillness of a life lived in refinement. Only I was different. The girl who walked through these doors 3 years ago was an architect of her own exile, a woman who had shrouded her identity as an Aries in a coarse, uncomfortable cloak, naively believing that love could exist in a vacuum, untainted by the pedigree or the fortune that defined me. In the quiet parlor, Mother busied herself with the ritual of tea, the clink of fine china a fragile sound in the vast room. She set a cup of chamomile before me, her eyes tracing the contours of my face, eyes etched with a sorrow so deep it felt like a mirror to my own. "I shouldn't have let you do this foolish thing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I offered a wan ghost of a smile, my hands wrapping around the porcelain to draw warmth into my chilled skin. "I just wanted a love that wasn't because I am a vanguard Aries," I admitted, the truth tasting like ash on my tongue. "I wanted someone to love me just for the woman beneath the name." That was the singular romantic ambition that had driven me to beg my mother for this masquerade. To live as a junior architect earning a pittance, to seek out Vance, a man with a charismatic smile and the ambition of a rising manager. I began to unspool the thread of my 3-year imprisonment. I spoke of the apartment in Queens, the one Eleanor would sneer at as if its lack of marble was a moral failing. I spoke of the hours spent hunched over a stove, crafting elaborate meals only to receive biting, passive-aggressive critiques the moment they hit the table. I spoke of the nights Vance returned home, his suit reeking of expensive bourbon and the cloying floral scent of women whose names I would never know. When I dared to confront him, the world would twist under his gaslighting. I was the hysterical wife, the woman prone to acting out, while my own possessions, the Hermes Birkins, the Chanel jackets that were my birthright, remained entombed in the deepest recesses of my closet, hidden away for fear that my mother-in-law would brand me a gold digger, a parasite sucking her son's accounts dry. I had been an unpaid maid, a convenient shadow, a bank account with a heartbeat, enduring it all because I clung to the delusional hope that if I just sacrificed enough of myself, he would eventually see me and find me worthy. But I had learned the cruelest lesson of all. The more you diminish yourself, the more they will revel in trampling you. When the silence returned, my mother did not weep. Instead, a terrifying icy rage kindled in the depths of her eyes, a look that promised reckoning. She pulled me into her arms and the dam broke once more. "My sweet girl, you have suffered enough," she murmured against my hair. "From now on, no one in this city will dare look down on you. Promise." I buried my face in the silk of her blouse, the fabric damp with the salt water of my grief. I cried for the vanity of my innocence, for the 3 years of my youth that had been discarded like refuse, and for the realization that my naive search for pure love had exacted a price I could never have anticipated. The next morning, I awoke in my own canopy bed, the fabric cool against my cheek. The light filtered through the heavy drapes in soft golden shafts, an atmosphere of absolute, reverent silence, a sharp healing contrast to the jagged, aggressive siren wails of queens. For the first time in 3 years, I felt the absence of the phantom pressure of my mother-in-law's scathing texts or the frantic, jarring vibration of Vance's phone at ungodly hours. The peace was almost disorienting. I sat up, hoping that the previous night was merely a fever dream, but as I caught my reflection in the vanity mirror, the red, blossoming swell on my cheek stared back at me, a visceral, permanent monument to my own folly. I rose and moved downstairs, where the private chef had laid out a plate of buttermilk waffles and a cup of rich, dark coffee. As I took the first bite, the flavor was divine, yet it tasted incredibly delicious. Perhaps it was not merely the flavor of the butter and toasted grain, but the intoxicating taste of liberation itself, a flavor I had been starved of for 3 grueling years. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was no sharp, biting critique of my calorie intake, no impatient tap of a designer heel against the hardwood floor to hasten my departure, and no suffocating atmosphere of performative perfection. I was allowed to simply exist. While I lingered over the coffee, Mother moved with a silent, feline grace, placing an iPad onto the cool marble of the island. Her expression was neutral, yet her eyes held a flickering, dangerous intelligence. I swiped the screen, and the headlines erupted before me like a series of controlled detonations. They were a singular, deafening chorus of catastrophe. Vanguard Holdings pulls the plug on the $400 million megaproject with Sterling Apex. The questions were frantic, desperate, and laden with the stench of corporate mortality. What is the future for Sterling Apex after the failed deal of the decade? The stock market had not even fully awakened before the shares began their terminal descent, plummeting at the opening bell with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a lead weight dropped into an abyss. It was a masterclass in calculated destruction, unfolding exactly as the architecture of our strategy had predicted. Sterling Apex, that hollow gilded empire built entirely on the shaky pillars of leverage and deceit, was finally buckling under its own weight. I began to scroll, my thumb moving rhythmically against the glass. Business forums, Reddit subthreads, and high-frequency trading chat rooms were a hive of frantic speculation. Some analysts, blinded by their own arrogance, insisted the financials were cooked from within. Others whispered of a predatory, hostile takeover by some unseen rival. They searched for complex corporate conspiracies, never suspecting that the epicenter of this tectonic shift on Wall Street was nothing more than the phantom sting of a single spiteful slap against my cheek. A wave of vengeance surged through me, a sweet dark honey that coated my heart. I imagined the color draining from Vance's face as his portfolio turned to dust, and the sheer, unadulterated fury that must be contorting Eleanor's features at this very moment. But even as the satisfaction bloomed, it began to wither, replaced by a cold, hollow vacuum. I looked at the headlines and wondered, is this it? If I watch them surrender to Chapter 11, if I see the walls of their pride crumble, Will it truly wash away the phantom pain of 3 years of relentless psychological erosion? I was not certain. But I knew that this was not merely a scorched earth vendetta. It was a reclamation project. I was gathering the shards of my own dignity, piece by agonizing piece, from the rubble they had left of my life. Suddenly the silence was shattered. My phone began to shriek against the counter, vibrating with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. Vance. He was calling with the desperation of a drowning man, ignoring the fact that he was the one who had opened the floodgates. When I allowed the call to terminate, the silence of the room felt heavier, only to be immediately pierced by the frantic chime of iMessages. A deluge of blue bubbles flooded my screen, a pathetic montage of cowardice. Sloan, I know I was an idiot. Forgive me this once. It was all my mother's fault. I never wanted this. Do you know if we lose this Vanguard deal? My whole family is ruined. Are you really that vindictive? I read every word, my pulse as steady and cold as the marble beneath my hands. Vindictive. He had the gall to cast himself as the victim of my retribution. Where was this moral compass when he paraded a runway model under my nose as his destined soulmate? Where was his empathy when his mother, draped in the jewels of a legacy I helped maintain, struck me across the face for the amusement of New York's elite? I felt no tremor of hesitation. I simply pressed my thumb against the screen, silencing him forever. Once the adrenaline subsided, the architect in me recognized that sentimentality was a luxury I could no longer afford. I needed a tactical advantage. The battle for the bank accounts was one thing, but the dissolution of our marriage under New York state law was a labyrinth of equitable distribution and legal warfare. I needed a shark, someone who viewed the courtroom not as a place of justice, but as a battlefield for total annihilation. Mother had assured me she knew the very best. The following morning, I stood before a sleek glass monolith in Midtown, my reflection caught in the polished steel of the private elevator. The offices of the firm were a study in intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the verdant expanse of Central Park, domesticating the chaos of the city. A lush, towering fiddle-leaf fig stood in the reception, its organic greenery a stark contrast to the sterile, high-stakes precision of the atmosphere. I was still adjusting my blazer when a man emerged from a conference room, his presence immediately shifting the gravity of the room. He was striking tall, with a jawline that suggested unyielding discipline and eyes that burned with a sharp, analytical intelligence behind tortoiseshell frames. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that sent a jolt of recognition through my marrow. "I am Declan, the senior partner who will be handling your case." The cadence of his speech, the specific way he tilted his head, it was a ghost from a past I had long ago buried. I looked up, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. My breath caught in my throat, strangled by the sheer impossibility of the moment. "Declan? Are you Declan Hayes from my undergrad cohort at Columbia?" I breathed, the professional mask I had spent all morning perfecting slipping entirely from my face. The man halted, his posture stiffening as if he had been struck by a bolt of electricity. He squinted, searching my face with an intensity that stripped away the years, before a slow, genuine smile blossomed. One that held the warmth of a sun-drenched dormitory hall in a decade long gone. "Sloan? It really is you," he murmured, his voice softening into a rare, authentic tone of disbelief. "It has been an eternity. I never in 1,000 years expected to see you walk through these doors under these specific circumstances." It turned out the prestigious, iron-fisted firm my mother had touted was co-founded by the boy who had once shared my late-night study sessions in the library stacks. In the suffocating, glittering cage of Manhattan power players, I realized with a shudder that the world was, in fact, a remarkably small place, and that my salvation had arrived in the form of a friend I thought I had lost to the sands of time. The mere presence of a familiar face, a ghost from a past I had long tucked away in the dusty corners of my memory, acted as a balm upon the raw, pulsating nerves of my current reality. The suffocating formality of the firm seemed to thin, replaced by a tentative, fragile air of intimacy. Declan stood, his movements possessing a grace that spoke of hard-won confidence, and ushered me into his corner office. A cathedral of glass and steel overlooking the sprawling, indifferent beast of Manhattan. As we settled into the plush, leather-bound chairs, the years seemed to evaporate. We spoke in fragments at first, then in a cascade of shared recollection. I watched him, searching for the boy I once knew, the brilliant, quiet scholarship student who lived behind a fortress of heavy textbooks, yet who possessed the singular, quiet courage to stand between me and a pack of entitled frat boys, his slender frame trembling but his resolve immovable. He had been a protector in an era before I knew I needed one. Now he was a heavyweight litigator, his features sharpened by the relentless friction of the courtroom, yet the light in his eyes, that steadfast, earnest gaze, remained unchanged. Once the pleasantries subsided, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of the confession I was about to unleash. I laid it all out, the hollow architecture of my 3-year marriage, the grotesque deception, and the final shattering disaster at the plaza under the blinding glare of the cameras. I spoke until my throat felt lined with ash. Declan listened with an intensity that bordered on the spiritual, his silence not merely a lack of words, but a profound, active engagement. He did not judge. He held space for my grief. When I recounted the sting of the slap, that final degrading indignity, I saw a flicker pass across his face, a momentary fracture in his composed exterior, exposing a jagged, dangerous edge of pure, unadulterated fury. He tapped his pen, the rhythmic click-clack echoing against the silence like a countdown. Before his voice broke the tension, it was no longer the voice of a college friend. It was the voice of a man who had declared war. "Sloan, rest assured, I will utterly dismantle them for you. It isn't just loyalty," he added, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register. "I have my own debts to settle with Sterling Apex." The promise hung between us, heavy and electric. I didn't press for the details. The instinct for self-preservation was gone, replaced by a burgeoning, fierce trust. He looked at me then, and in that fleeting second, I was back in the sanctuary of the university library, shielded from the world. A fragile sense of security began to take root in the wasteland of my life. I knew the road ahead was a grueling war of attrition, a slow grind of documents and depositions, but I was no longer walking into the abyss alone. A few days later, the sky above Manhattan was a bruised, weeping gray, a persistent drizzle blurring the sharp edges of the skyscrapers. I sat in his office again, the internal landscape of my mind occupied by a singular, cold calculation. We had mapped the contours of the divorce, the strategic maneuvers designed to insulate my premarital vanguard trust from Vance's insatiable reach. Yet, Declan's earlier mention of his vendetta gnawed at me. There was a story beneath the case, a private trauma fueling his professional fire. As he pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, staring past the glass toward the horizon, I knew the moment of unveiling had arrived. "Sloan," he started, his voice thick with a sorrow that transcended professional boundaries, "perhaps I should tell you the truth. Taking on Sterling isn't a task. It's a crusade. It's a debt of blood." He rose abruptly, pacing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. His hands, thrust deep into his trouser pockets, were clenched so tightly the knuckles turned a ghostly white. "That project, the $400 million eco-luxury community they are so proud of. Do you have any idea what that land truly is?" I shook my head, my mind racing through the hazy memories of Vance's arrogant boasts about Hudson Valley real estate. Declan's voice became a phantom, tinged with a devastating, distant grief. "It was an apple orchard, a working farm. My grandparents' home. A lifetime of sweat, of Macintosh and Honey Crisp, of cider in the autumn air. It was my sanctuary. My heart constricted as the image of that idyllic, pastoral innocence collided violently with the cold, sterile luxury of the world Sterling apex built. Declan's jaw tightened, the lines of his face hardening into granite. 10 years ago, Richard Sterling came for it. He spoke of progress and development, hiding his malice behind the thin veil of the law, using every coercive, shadow-dwelling tactic in his arsenal to drive them out. They were farmers humble and rooted in the soil, completely defenseless against the predatory march of a billionaire's legal machinery. They refused to sell, clinging to that land as one clings to a life raft. But then, the shadows grew longer, stretching like hungry fingers across the threshold of our defiance. Richard Sterling, a man who viewed human lives as mere decimals in a ledger, did not simply stop at theft. He began to systematically dismantle the remnants of our legacy. He deployed his private fixers, faceless men in charcoal suits whose cruelty was as precise as a surgeon's blade. They didn't use threats that could be recorded. They used the language of destruction. One suffocating summer night, the fragile glass of my grandmother's greenhouse, the pride of her morning routine, was reduced to jagged crystalline shards, leaving the scent of crushed petals and shattered dreams in the damp air. Only a week later, the silence of the pasture was broken by the agonizing yelp of my grandfather's loyal shepherd, a dog that had walked every inch of that land with him for a decade. The poisoned meat he had ingested turned our sanctuary into a tomb. My grandfather, a man built from the stoic bedrock of the valley, finally crumbled. It wasn't just the loss of the soil that broke him. It was the relentless, suffocating tide of legal fees and the persistent, chilling presence of strangers lurking at our gate. A massive stroke felled him, pulling the color from his cheeks and the strength from his hands. To cover the medical bills that accumulated like a mountain in the wake of his collapse, my grandmother was forced to commit an act of absolute heartbreak. She signed the deed over to a Sterling shell company, receiving a pittance that felt like an insult to the century of sweat embedded in that dirt. Declan turned back to look at me, and in the harsh glare of the lamplight, the unhidden pain etched into his sharp features was like a raw, weeping wound. My grandfather didn't make it, you know, he whispered, his voice trembling with a grief that hadn't dulled in 10 years. He died in that sterile hospital bed, holding my hand with a grip that felt like a plea. He kept saying it over and over, his voice a ghost of its former self. Study the law, Declan. Become the shield they never had. Demand justice for the people the system forgets. This debt isn't about equity, Sloan. It's a generational trauma. It is the repressed, smoldering anger of honest people who were crushed into the dust by the weight of corporate greed. Declan's story blew through me like an Arctic wind, a cold, piercing clarity that fanned the dying embers of my own resentment into a roaring blaze. But it also cauterized my panic, making my mind clearer and sharper than it had ever been. I realized then that to defeat a cunning, serpentine syndicate like Richard and Vance Sterling, we could not rely on the hollow promises of family court or the performative vanity of PR maneuvers. We needed hard, cold evidence of racketeering, and we had to move with the ghost-like stealth of those who operate in the dark. Focusing intensely on this tactical necessity helped me temporarily bury the agony of my personal betrayal. I turned my grief into a weapon, a razor-sharp tool for the impending war. Declan and I sat down, the quiet of the room replaced by the scratch of pens and the rustle of maps, to draft a forensic plan. The battle would be fought on two fronts. I, with the distinct, dangerous advantage of having lived in their gilded cage for 3 years, would be responsible for providing the internal breadcrumbs, the secrets that lived in the corners of their marble hallways. Declan, armed with his subpoena power and the formidable reach of his investigative resources, would gather the hard, verifiable proof. I began to dig through the cavernous vaults of my memory, trying to string together fragmented, seemingly innocuous pieces of information I had ignored while I was busy playing the part of the beautiful, compliant housewife. I recalled my father-in-law's late-night burner phone calls, the way he would step out onto the terrace in the dead of winter, his breath hitching in the cold, speaking in hushed, jagged tones. I remembered the names he repeated, names that surfaced like dark debris in a flooded river. I remembered the nights Vance returned home late from networking, smelling of expensive whiskey and desperation, leaving crumpled, incriminating receipts from underground poker dens and exclusive members only gentlemen's clubs carelessly tucked into his tailored suit pockets. I remembered Eleanor, his wife, casually boasting over champagne about the generous gifts she provided to certain officials on the city's zoning board. Gifts that always seemed to precede a sudden change in project approvals. Most notably, I remembered a figure named Silas, an intimidating, hulking man with eyes like flint whom my father-in-law met privately at a secluded, smoke-filled cigar lounge in Tribeca. Every time Richard returned from those clandestine meetings, he carried a frantic, paranoid energy, his eyes darting as if he expected the walls to speak. I wrote down every name, every address, and every seemingly harmless recurring habit on a legal pad until my fingers cramped. 3 years of being treated like a piece of furniture had, quite ironically, given me a surveillance perspective that no one else in their inner circle possessed. These fragments were the keys to unlocking Sterling Apex's RICO violations, the jagged puzzle pieces of a criminal empire. Meanwhile, Declan began an even more grueling task. He sought to reconnect with the families of the Hudson Valley, the survivors who had lost their inheritance a decade ago. It was an uphill climb. 10 years is a lifetime, and the diaspora of the displaced had scattered them to the winds. Many had moved out of state, their addresses lost to time. The few who remained carried an invisible, paralyzing fear, the psychic scar tissue of those who have been crushed by money and muscle, and have learned that hope is a liability. Some hung up the moment they heard the name Sterling, the trauma echoing in the click of the phone. Others slammed their screen doors, refusing to let the past back into their homes. But Declan was not a man easily deterred. He stopped wearing his tailored Tom Ford suits, opting instead for worn denim and a plain jacket, appearing not as a lawyer, but as a grandson seeking the truth. He sat in local diners nursing lukewarm coffee, sharing his own family's tragedy to bridge the gap. Gradually, the icy wall of fear and distrust began to melt. A few brave souls emerged, digging out yellowed tax records and the falsified environmental reports Sterling had once used to strong-arm them. With each passing day, our leverage grew. Declan's office slowly transformed into a war room, the walls papered with plat maps, shell company dossiers, and a web of red string connecting the dots of corruption. As we delved deeper into the rot of their operation, the Sterlings began to make their countermoves, their panic manifesting as a subtle, tightening pressure. They couldn't just sit still and watch their stock tank and their secrets get probed. They were creatures of habit, predators who had built an empire on the fragility of human silence, and they were not about to let a few scavengers pick apart their foundation. But I had naively underestimated the sheer savagery of their nature. I expected legal injunctions or corporate sabotage, not the cold, blunt edge of physical violence. The transition from the intellectual rigor of Declan's office to the isolation of my own life was jarring. That evening, the rain was a mere drizzle, a silver mist against the city lights as I steered my Range Rover into the subterranean quiet of the townhouse garage. The space was a cavern of concrete and artificial light, thick with the rhythmic, mechanical hum of industrial ventilation. My heels clicked against the polished floor, a sharp, lonely sound that amplified my sudden sense of vulnerability. As I reached for the handle of my purse to extract my keys, the air in the garage seemed to shift. A shadow detached itself from the gloom behind a thick structural pillar, blocking my path to the elevator. My pulse spiked, a sudden frantic bird battering against my ribs. Under the sickly yellow pallor of the overhead fluorescent lights, the figure resolved into a terrifying reality. It was Silas. I remembered him from the haze of the cigar lounge, that den of vice where Richard's whims were carried out by men who saw the world only in terms of what could be broken. He stood there like a monolith of malice, a man built like a cinder block, his jaw marked by a jagged silvery scar that seemed to pull his face into a permanent mocking sneer. His eyes were the most disturbing part, flat, glassy, and utterly devoid of anything resembling a soul. "Evening, Mrs. Sterling," he rasped, his voice a gravelly texture that grated against my nerves like sandpaper. "Or should I say, Miss Kensington? You look vastly different when you aren't playing the part of the dutiful housewife in an apron." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I forced my fingers to lock around the strap of my Birkin bag, my thumb finding the hidden panic button on my phone, praying it would be enough. "What do you want, Silas?" I demanded, though my voice sounded thinner than I intended. He didn't answer immediately. He took a predatory step forward, the smell of him washing over me, a sickening cocktail of cheap cologne and the stale, acrid odor of long-dead tobacco. It turned my stomach, a physical manifestation of the filth he represented. He smiled, a jagged motion that never reached those dead eyes. "I just wanted to drop by and pay my respects to the boss's arranged daughter-in-law. I hear you've been remarkably industrious lately, wasting your evenings in the offices of high-priced lawyers, rummaging through public archives in the North. Why chase ghosts, Sloan? I'm telling you this as a favor, a simple courtesy between professionals. Some graves are sealed for a reason. Leave the past to rot where it lies. Fish cannot survive in the toxins of a dead river, and you, my dear, are far too polished for this kind of filth. You are young, you are wealthy, and you have a lifetime of luxury ahead of you. Do not complicate your existence for the sake of a few dirt farmers." Every syllable was a sharpened blade, wrapped in the silk of civility. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His composure was infinitely more chilling than an outburst could ever be. I knew, with the primal instinct of a cornered animal, that he was capable of making people vanish into the sprawling, unfeeling belly of the New York real estate underworld. Yet, even as the cold spike of terror pierced my chest, a fire ignited beneath it. If they had sent their bulldog to bark at my heels, it meant Declan and I had finally struck a vital organ. We were drawing blood. I took a deep, jagged breath, steadying the tremor in my lungs. "Thank you for your unsolicited concern, Silas," I said, my voice finally finding its cold, steady edge. "But I am fully aware of my trajectory. Now step aside or I shall summon my security detail to remove you." For a heartbeat, raw, incandescent fury flared in his eyes, a flicker of the beast behind the mask. He stared me down, an agonizing silent duel, before the corner of his mouth twitched into a dismissive smirk. He took a slow, deliberate step back. "Have it your way. Seems you have finally grown a spine. But do remember, Mrs. Sterling, glass houses are fragile things. Let us hope you possess the wisdom to know when to walk away before you bring the whole ceiling down on your own head." With that, he dissolved back into the shadows, his footsteps silent as he made for the exit. I scrambled toward the elevator, my hand trembling so violently I could barely depress the call button. I didn't dare look back, but the phantom weight of his gaze remained pressed against my spine until the steel doors hissed shut, sealing me in a temporary sanctuary. I thought that was the end of the intimidation, but Silas was merely the prologue. They didn't just want to scare me. They wanted to extinguish the threat entirely. A few days later, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple, and a relentless nor'easter clawed at the city. I had a meeting across the RFK bridge, a desperate appointment with a municipal clerk who held the final piece of the puzzle. The rain turned the road into a slick, treacherous ribbon of black oil. Traffic crawled, a serpentine line of red taillights bleeding into the storm. As I began the descent of the bridge, I tapped the brake pedal to maintain my distance from a towering semi-truck ahead. The pedal gave way with sickening ease, plunging to the floorboard as if it were tethered to nothing. My heart leapt into my throat, a suffocating realization of impending mortality. The brakes were dead. My heavy SUV, stripped of its ability to stop, began to surge forward, caught by gravity and the incline. accelerating toward the bumper of the truck like a bullet fired from a gun. Blind panic clawed at my senses for a fractured second, threatening to paralyze me. But I shoved the fear into a box and reached for the training my father had hammered into me during long, quiet afternoons at the track. I ripped my foot from the accelerator, yanked the electronic emergency brake, and slammed the transmission into a lower gear, praying to whatever deity might be listening that the engine braking would force the massive vehicle into submission. A desperate gamble against physics itself. The SUV groaned, a mechanical beast resisting the transition. Before the tires finally caught hold, the car fishtailed violently across the slick asphalt, the screech of rubber against wet pavement rising to a piercing, deafening crescendo that seemed to drown out the very storm itself. Everything warped into a surreal slow motion, where the raindrops hung suspended like diamonds in the air. Through the rain-streaked windshield, the rusted steel bumper of the semi-truck loomed, an iron wall of certain death growing larger with every heartbeat. My survival instinct overrode every shred of logic. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, hurling the heavy frame into the adjacent lane. The car hydroplaned, spinning in a sickening dance, nearly clipping a yellow cab whose driver's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Horns blared around me, a cacophony of panicked warnings, while other drivers stared in visceral horror, witnessing the metal death trap barreling through the highway. I gritted my teeth until my jaw ached, my fingers turning ghost white as I white-knuckled the leather steering wheel. My entire existence distilled into the desperate, agonizing struggle to govern 2 tons of runaway steel. Finally, after a bone-jarring metallic scream of a scrape against the concrete Jersey barrier, the SUV ground to a shuddering halt. The airbags deployed with a concussive pop, a sudden blinding cloud of chemical dust that punched the air from my lungs and left me dazed, drowning in the sudden, ringing silence of a spinning world. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, my ears ringing with a high-pitched drone, my heart hammering against my ribs with such savage intensity that I feared the bones themselves might splinter. The cabin was a suffocating tomb of acrid burnt rubber, and the sharp metallic tang of the airbag's gunpowder scent. Outside, the traffic had pooled into a stagnant sea, the crimson glow of tail lights bleeding into the relentless pouring rain. Trembling with a post-adrenaline palsy, I fumbled with the handle and forced the door open, stumbling out into the biting downpour. When I looked back at the crushed front quarter panel and the long jagged black skid marks scarring the bridge, the icy realization of death washed over me with a delayed sickening weight. Had I hesitated for even a fraction of a second, I would have been pulped under the iron teeth of the 18-wheeler or launched over the railing into the churning dark of the East River. The initial shock evaporated as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by an inferno, an icy, seething, murderous rage that settled deep in my marrow. I didn't reach for an ambulance. There was no room for victimhood. I called Declan, my voice a jagged edge, and then I called the NYPD. When the police and a forensic mechanic finally arrived under the harsh glare of the floodlights, the preliminary inspection confirmed my most harrowing suspicion. The brake lines hadn't just failed, they had been sabotaged. A clean, deliberate, surgical cut with a wire snip. This was no mechanical misfortune. This was cold-blooded attempted homicide. Sitting on the damp, cold pavement in the freezing rain, watching the flatbed winch my ruined car away, my heart hardened into flint. Silas's voice echoed in the recesses of my mind like a taunt. Glass houses shatter easily. They weren't trying to intimidate me anymore. They wanted me in a body bag. They wanted to silence Vanguard's assets and the divorce proceedings with my silence in the grave. The final moral boundary had been obliterated, erased by the threat of my own extinction. Any lingering hesitation, any pathetic, fragile thought of a quiet settlement, vanished into the rain. This war would no longer be fought in boardrooms. It would end in total annihilation. The incident on the RFK bridge served as a brutal catalyst, forging my resolve and Declan's into something cold, sharp, and unbreakable: titanium. The incident also generated massive heat, forcing the NYPD to open an official criminal investigation into attempted murder and vehicular sabotage, though we both knew that pinning the knife directly to Richard Sterling's palm would be an uphill battle against his vast resources. The police pressure forced the Sterling family to bunker down, and we knew our window of opportunity was rapidly closing. We had to accelerate our offensive before Silas pulled another lethal stunt. Luck finally smiled upon us, not from the detectives, but from Declan's relentless subterranean digging. After days of running on pure adrenaline and cold espresso, Declan arrived at my townhouse, his eyes bloodshot, clutching a flash drive like a holy relic. He explained that a private investigator he'd retained had secured security camera footage from a luxury condo building directly across from my garage entrance. The camera was angled to capture the sidewalk, but it caught a sliver of the alley leading into my private parking structure. We sat in my study, the only light in the room the harsh blue glare reflecting off his MacBook screen. He played the footage from the night before my accident, looping it over and over. The image was grainy, a mosaic of low-light noise and rain-streaked darkness, but after staring at the flickers until my eyes burned, we spotted the ghost. At exactly 3:15 a.m., a figure in a dark hoodie stealthily approached the garage gate, bypassed the electronic lock with a cloner, and slipped into the shadows. 10 minutes later he walked back out. We couldn't clearly see his face, but his hulking build and a distinct uneven limp were unmistakable. Declan deployed enhancement software, fighting the digital noise to stabilize a single frame. As the man reached up to pull his hood down, a tiny chilling detail emerged under the faint artificial glow of a street lamp. On the man's thick wrist, a coarse ink-stained shape emerged from the shadows, a crude, jagged tattoo of a scorpion, its tail curled in a silent, permanent threat. The sight hit me like a physical blow, a sudden plunge into glacial water. My spine stiffened as a bone-deep chill crawled upward, hitching in my throat. Memory, sharp and cruel, dragged me back to that suffocating night in the garage. I saw it again. Silas, his frame leaning casually against the concrete pillar, his arrogance radiating like heat. His sleeve had bunched upward just enough, exposing that very same mark. The scorpion, the signature of a predator. But Declan, tireless and driven by a singular, focused intensity, did not stop at the revelation. He waded into the murky depths of his criminal defense network, pulling strings and trading favors with the kind of men who kept the city's dark secrets. By the time the first light of dawn bled through the blinds, painting the room in hues of bruised gray, he had his answer. The man in the video was not Silas himself. That would have been too clumsy, too direct for a man of his stature. It was Jax, a known enforcer, a creature of violence whose knuckles were permanently scarred from the dirty work he performed for Silas's syndicate. Jax had just crawled out from the shadow of parole, and according to the digital trail Declan had unearthed, he was officially drawing a salary from a shell security firm under the umbrella of Sterling Apex. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a terrifying absolute precision. Holding that digital evidence, a smoking gun captured in grainy pixels, I felt a surge of predatory relief. It was not yet enough to drag a billionaire to the gallows of a federal courtroom, but it was the crack in the foundation we had been praying for. I turned to Declan. His tie was loosened, hanging like a discarded noose around his neck, and the dark, heavy crescents under his eyes spoke of 3 sleepless nights spent in the service of my salvation. A profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude crashed over me. "Thank you, Declan," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the realization. "If it weren't for you, I would still be drowning in the dark." Declan simply smiled, a weary, fragile movement that reached his eyes and stayed there. He rubbed his face with both hands, his expression softening into a tenderness that felt entirely out of place in this room of cold screens and dossiers. "Between us, Sloan, there is no tally to keep," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor me to the earth. "Everything I do, I do to honor my grandfather's dying wish. We are forged in this fire together side by side. The raw intensity in his gaze made my breath hitch. In the center of this hurricane of corporate betrayal and death threats, he was my sole sanctuary, the only thing keeping me from unraveling into the madness of the life I had been forced to lead. We knew the endgame was barreling toward us, and with our backs pressed against one another, I knew we would not fall. While we meticulously constructed the scaffolding of a federal case, the Sterling Empire was beginning to rot from the inside out. This high-stakes chess game was far more complex than a simple clash between me, Declan, and the Sterlings. The board was littered with pawns and parasites, beings who would devour their own hosts just to secure another day of breathing. Cleo, the runway model Vance had flaunted like a trophy, was the most dangerous parasite of all. She had watched the Sterling Apex stock plummet, saw the golden ship taking on water, and her predator's instinct kicked in with lethal efficiency. One humid afternoon, my phone shivered against the mahogany desk, displaying a blocked number. When I answered, a voice drifted through the line, honeyed sweet, yet vibrating with the frantic frequency of desperation. "Hi Sloan, it's Cleo. We really need to talk." My eyebrow arched, a flicker of cold amusement igniting in my chest. I felt no surprise, only a grim satisfaction. I agreed to the meeting. We met in the hollow silence of a Tribeca speakeasy, a place of dim amber lights and leather booths that smelled of expensive regret. Cleo appeared like a ghost, shielded by gargantuan Celine sunglasses and a heavy trench coat. She slid into the booth, her movements jerky and paranoid. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Sloan, I know you are hunting for blood, and I have the blade that will hand you Vance's head on a silver platter." She produced an iPhone, sliding it across the table like a contraband offering, and tapped the play icon. Vance's voice emerged, muffled by the device but unmistakable, arrogant, chillingly casual, and dripping with a sociopathy that made my heart stutter. "Relax, Cleo. Sloan is utterly clueless. She's just a trust fund brat who wants to play house. Once the Vanguard deal closes and I secure that $400 million, my father and I are stripping the assets and moving them offshore. I'll blindside her with the divorce papers and she won't see a single cent of alimony. Then we take the yacht to St. Bart's, just you and me." A sickening breathy giggle followed Cleo's voice, intertwined with Vance's vile, empty promises. I sat motionless, sipping my sparkling water, my face a mask of impenetrable stone, even though the love I once held for him had withered into ash long ago. Hearing the calculated, premeditated malice of his plan chilled my blood to ice. For 3 agonizing years, I had been married to a smiling shark, never realizing the teeth were meant for me. Cleo stopped the recording and watched me with predatory hunger, clearly expecting me to shatter, to cry, to provide the visceral reaction she could feed upon. "Well, with this, you can completely incinerate his character in divorce court. The judge will grant you everything you desire." I remained silent, the only sound the faint chime of my glass as I swirled the lime, waiting for her to reveal the price. She leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a greedy, unvarnished hunger. "I'll airdrop this file to you right now," she whispered, her lips curling into a thin line. "But I want $5 million. That's just a drop in the ocean for the Vanguard heiress, right?" I looked directly into her heavily contoured face, my gaze unnervingly calm, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. I felt a profound disgust for the man who had spoken those words, and equal disgust for the opportunist sitting across from me, a woman who wore her lack of morality like a designer accessory, brazenly attempting to extort a fortune from someone her own boyfriend had systematically broken. It was a grotesque symmetry. They truly deserved each other, 2 predators circling a carcass, oblivious to the fact that the meat was already rotten. A sudden chilling clarity washed over me. I would rather ignite a pyre and watch my millions turn to ash than surrender a single cent to the likes of Cleo. I let out a soft, melodic chuckle, A sound so genuinely amused and untethered from the tension in the room that it landed like a slap, instantly wiping the practiced smugness from her carefully sculpted face. "Cleo, I appreciate the hustle," I said, my voice smooth as silk, "but I have no use for your tape." Her jaw tightened, the skin around her mouth pulling into a sharp, jagged line. "Are you crazy?" she hissed, her composure fracturing. "He was going to leave you with absolutely nothing." I stood up slowly, the movement deliberate and unhurried. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer, feeling the sharp fabric against my palms. "And now he has nothing. I suggest you keep that recording. Who knows? Perhaps TMZ will pay you $50 for it once he is in handcuffs." With a final dismissive flick of my wrist, I dropped a $100 bill onto the table, a generous tip for the water I had barely touched, and walked out. I left her sitting alone in the heavy gloom of the cafe, her features a mask of panic and sudden, dawning impotence. I knew the architecture of a narcissist like Cleo. She would not accept this loss in the silence of her own home. She was a creature of noise and validation, and I was counting on her fatal lack of impulse control to be the final nail in her own coffin. The following day I played the long game. Through a series of surgically precise, whispered phone calls to my contacts at Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, I leaked confirmed rumors that the SEC was breathing down the neck of Sterling Apex's offshore accounts. The dominoes began to fall before the news cycle even caught up. Banks started calling in their leverage with a predatory hunger. The Sterling family accounts, once considered ironclad, were mere days away from being frozen, locked behind federal mandates. The panic rippling through the financial sector was absolute, a silent electric scream of impending ruin. Just as I had predicted, Cleo was the first to snap. The Technicolor fantasy of a $5 million payout from me had evaporated, and the man who was supposed to be her golden ticket was on the precipice of a federal indictment. To a woman whose entire identity was built upon the veneer of proximity to wealth, being tethered to a broke, disgraced CEO was the ultimate social suicide. She calculated her survival, and in her arrogance, she chose the path of the martyr. If she couldn't strip mine his pockets, she would strip mine his legacy. Cleo didn't sell the recording to a tabloid. She opted for the digital guillotine. She uploaded the raw, unfiltered audio directly to her millions of followers on Instagram and TikTok, stitching it together with a multi-part, tear-soaked video monologue. She claimed that Vance had emotionally manipulated her, deceived her about the status of his marriage, and held her captive within a toxic, suffocating dynamic. She weaponized the lexicon of modern therapy, wielding buzzwords like shields to paint herself as the fragile, victimized muse of a narcissistic billionaire. The posts went stratospheric viral in a way that defied explanation. The internet, already ravenous for the sight of the vanguard Sterling empire in flames, treated this like the Super Bowl of scandal. The recording of Vance bragging about his asset-hiding schemes and his heartless abandonment of his wife became a global trend. The carefully curated image of the brilliant, philanthropic young CEO collapsed into dust, incinerated by his own words. He was branded a sociopath, a fraud, and the undisputed villain of the digital age. I sat in my library, the scent of old paper and wood smoke grounding me as I scrolled through the vicious, scathing comments and biting memes about Vance on my iPad. I felt no hollow sense of vindication, only a dry, intellectual irony. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. I hadn't needed to dirty my hands. I had merely provided the stage, and the rats had cannibalized one another. Eleanor, who had spent decades obsessing over her status and social standing, was now the mother of a pariah, a legacy anchored to a sinking ship. I simply sat by the fire, sipping a deep, complex red, watching the screen light up with the spectacle of their digital execution. One evening, while a torrential New York downpour hammered against the glass like iron pellets, I was poring over legal briefs from Declan when my head of security buzzed the intercom, his voice taut. Vance had bypassed the street gate and was now standing on the threshold of my front door. I told security to hold their positions. I wanted to look him in the eye one final time, to see if there was a single ember of humanity glowing beneath the wreckage of his ego. I stood in the grand foyer, the vaulted ceiling echoing with the muffled roar of the storm. I opened the heavy oak door just enough to look through the cold, unyielding iron of the security gate. Vance stood on the stoop, utterly exposed to the freezing, relentless deluge. His bespoke suit, once a symbol of his untouchable status, was soaked through, the expensive fabric clinging to his gaunt, shivering frame. The arrogant, predatory swagger was entirely extinguished, replaced by the twitchy, desperate energy of a cornered animal clawing at the bars of a cage. Seeing me, he lunged toward the iron, his face a ghostly, bloodless white, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Sloan, please tell your guys to let me in," he croaked, his voice cracking, barely audible over the violence of the rain hitting the pavement. "Just 5 minutes, I beg you." I did not reach for the button to open the gate. I stood safely inside the warm, amber-lit foyer, regarding him as if he were a morbid exhibit in a museum of failures. "My lawyers have instructed you to direct all communication to them," I said, my voice as cold as the wind behind him. "Vance, we have nothing left to say to one another." We do," he whispered, nodding frantically, his head dipping low. Water streamed down his face, masking the tears he was so desperately trying to force. "Sloan, I am so sorry. I am a piece of garbage," he gasped, his chest heaving with every ragged, desperate breath. "I lost my mind, Sloan. I didn't mean any of it. The tape, that wretched recording. It was nothing but locker room bravado, a foolish, intoxicated attempt to shut Cleo up and keep the sharks at bay. I swear on my life I always loved you. I always have." I let out a laugh, but it possessed no mirth. It was a harsh, jagged sound that seemed to tear at the cold, damp air between us. "Loved me?" The irony was so thick it was suffocating. "You demonstrated your love by standing idly by while your mother laid her hands on me in public, leaving bruises that lasted longer than your apologies. You showcased your love by parading a mistress through our social circles like a trophy. You solidified that love by meticulously plotting to siphon our assets into offshore accounts, ensuring that when the dust settled, I would be left standing in the ashes, utterly destitute." His fingers hooked around the cold iron bars, his knuckles whitening until the skin stretched translucent and bloodless. "It was the pressure, Sloan. You have no conception of what it is like to bear the weight of a dying empire. My father, the board, the mountain of debt suffocating us. They expected me to be a predator, a ruthless killer who could dismantle anything for the sake of the bottom line. I had to project an aura of invincibility. And Cleo, she was merely a flicker of distraction from the crushing reality of the collapse. It meant nothing, I promise you." I stood there, listening to his pathetic, rehearsed monologue, a masterclass in the art of gaslighting and the cowardice of deflection. He hadn't changed. He was simply terrified of the consequences. He wasn't sorry for the betrayal. He was sorry that the world had finally seen his true face. I looked him directly in the eye, stripping away his veneer, my voice cutting through the relentless downpour like a shard of polished glass. "Are you quite done, Vance? Because the most tragic aspect of this entire farce isn't the infidelity or the calculated theft. It is the realization that even now, shivering and broken on my porch, you remain a profound coward. You hide behind the ghost of your father, the board, the stress of the markets. A man of integrity would own his wreckage. If you had truly loved me, you would have stood as my shield, not my executioner. If you had respected me, you would never have entertained the idea of stripping me of my autonomy. Save your performance for the federal judge." I reached out, my movements calm and deliberate, and slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt with a finality that resonated in my very bones. I did not turn back to watch him linger in the rain. The chapter was closed. I foolishly believed that the combination of the leaked audio and his abysmal performance on my doorstep would be the end of it, that the Sterlings would finally surrender to the wisdom of a crisis PR firm and retreat into the shadows. I had gravely underestimated the sheer, unhinged narcissism of Eleanor Sterling. To a woman of her ilk, public perception and avoiding a prison sentence were currencies worth any price, no matter how depraved. Her final desperate maneuver was so sociopathic, so deeply rooted in a perversion of reality, that I never could have anticipated it. She decided to weaponize the one thing society holds as sacred, the promise of new life. One morning my phone shattered the silence of my sanctuary, the caller ID flashing a name from my past, a distant aunt residing in Connecticut. Her voice when I answered was breathless, laced with a cocktail of shock and salacious excitement. "Sloan, darling, why in heaven's name didn't you tell us the news? Dealing with the trauma of a divorce is one thing, but hiding a pregnancy is quite another." I froze, my hand suspended in midair, the coffee cup halfway to my lips, the ceramic feeling suddenly brittle and cold. "Auntie, what on earth are you talking about?" "Eleanor," she gushed. "Eleanor Sterling just gave an exclusive tearful sit-down with Page 6. She showed them ultrasound photos, Sloan. She told the world you are 10 weeks pregnant with Vance's child, and that she is begging you to consider the welfare of this baby and cease this hostile divorce." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I hung up the phone, a wave of profound visceral nausea washing over me, turning my stomach into a knot of ice. They were inventing a phantom child, a life that didn't exist, to manipulate the court of public sympathy and ensnare me in a marriage I had already outgrown. Eleanor was painting me as a vindictive, hormonally volatile woman, a monster willing to destroy the father and grandparents of her own unborn baby simply out of spite. I immediately reached out to Declan. By the time I spoke to him, he was already staring at the digital article, his jaw set in a line of grim fury. Within hours, his investigators had traced the corruption back to its source. Eleanor, wielding her vast, dark checkbook, had bribed a concierge physician at an elite Upper East Side clinic. Together they had constructed a flawless, fraudulent medical dossier. Fabricated blood panels, spiked HCG levels, and a stolen sonogram image, digitally manipulated and labeled with my name, manifesting a 10-week fetus out of thin air. As I studied the digital copies Declan sent over, a rage so pure, so searing that it felt like molten lead ignited in my chest. This woman who had physically assaulted me was now draped in the mantle of the weeping grandmother on national television, using a ghost to rescue her son from his inevitable fate. The court of public opinion is a cruel, fickle beast, prone to the most vicious shifts in narrative. Once Page 6 broadcast the headline, the tide turned with sickening speed. Eleanor took to the morning talk shows, dabbing at her dry eyes with lace-edged tissues, pleading with me to return to the fold for the sake of her grandchild. She spun a web where the entire Vanguard disaster was reduced to a mere misunderstanding, amplified by my supposed pregnancy-induced instability. Online, the trolls swarmed, their vitriol a stinging rain of digital ash. "Wow, look at her, pregnant and still trying to bankrupt her baby daddy. Absolute psycho. She's nothing but a spoiled heiress using the judicial system to settle a grudge. Think of the kid, you selfish brat." The pressure was not just suffocating. It was an active force, pressing against my ribcage until I could barely breathe. Paparazzi camped outside my townhouse, their long lenses probing my windows like invasive insects. But I did not stop my work, for I knew that in the silence of their lies, I had to be the one to orchestrate the truth, knowing that the battle for my life had only just begun to turn into a war of attrition where every headline was a potential casualty, and I was being forced to defend a version of myself that had never existed against an enemy who played by no rules of humanity, while the world outside watched, waiting to see if I would buckle under the weight of a fabrication that promised to destroy the very core of my reputation, forcing me to realize that even after closing the door on Vance, The Sterling family had woven their toxicity into the very fabric of my identity, and the only way out was to burn their carefully constructed delusion to the ground, piece by agonizing piece, regardless of the scorched earth they were willing to leave in their wake, and I would be ready for them. Not crack. The silence within the sanctuary of my home became a cocoon, a cold, protective shell against the cacophony outside. I could feel the vibrations of the city, the relentless hum of news vans, the predatory clicking of shutter releases, the hungry whispers of a world convinced it knew the narrative of my life. But I was not the fragile, hormone-addled girl they painted in broad, ugly strokes. I was a strategist, and I knew that the bigger the lie, the more catastrophic the descent into the abyss. Eleanor thought she was weaving a web to ensnare me, but she had merely tethered herself to her own destruction. She wanted to shatter my spirit, to see me crawl back into a gilded cage of her design, but in her arrogance, she had handed me the heavy velvet-wrapped rope that would serve as her own gallows. I felt no need to scramble for a defense on social media, no desperate desire to tweet my way out of the quicksand. In the brutal theater of a media war, performative outrage is nothing more than a paper shield. When the air is thick with poisonous fiction, words are useless. You do not debate the fire, you extinguish it with the deluge of truth. I sat in my mother's private office, a room that smelled of old money, leather, and calculated silence. Margot Kensington, a woman whose iron resolve was the foundation of everything I knew to be strong, observed me over the rim of her spectacles. She was not concerned by the tempest raging in the streets. Her eyes, sharp and clear, held a chilling stillness. "Let them dig the hole a little deeper, Sloan," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor. "Then we bury them." The press conference at the Vanguard Holdings corporate auditorium in Manhattan was the stage for the final act. As I stepped through the heavy doors, the room transformed into a sensory assault. It was packed wall-to-wall with journalists, their faces hungry for a train wreck, financial reporters looking for a bloodbath, and paparazzi whose cameras fired like strobe lights in a dark, feverish dream. They were a pack of wolves waiting for me to break, expecting a tearful, unhinged reality TV-style confession about a pregnancy that existed only in Eleanor's malevolent imagination. I walked onto that stage, flanked by my mother and Declan, a triumvirate of unyielding resolve. I was dressed in a razor-sharp ivory Tom Ford pantsuit that acted as my armor, pristine, cutting, and impossible to ignore. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style, my posture a rigid line of defiance. I did not look like a woman who had been bullied. I looked like a woman who was reclaiming her empire. The room fell into a deathly, expectant silence as I adjusted the microphone. I stared directly into the unblinking, glass eyes of the network cameras, my gaze piercing through the lens to the millions watching on the other side. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," I began, my voice steady, resonant, and devoid of the tremors they craved. Before I addressed the fabricated tabloids regarding my personal life, Vanguard Holdings has a major corporate announcement. I pressed a clicker, and the massive high-definition screen behind me surged with life, displaying architectural renderings that seemed to hum with promise. Vanguard Holdings is committing $50 million to develop a comprehensive affordable housing and community center initiative. And specifically, this project will be built in the Hudson Valley, on the exact acreage that Sterling Apex unlawfully attempted to seize for a luxury resort. We are returning the land to the community, building sustainable housing for the working-class families who were displaced by corporate greed. The room erupted. It was a cacophony of scratching pens and frantic rapid-fire typing. I was not just building homes. I was publicly castrating Sterling's legacy, turning their stolen soil into a monument of philanthropy that would dwarf their vanity project. I raised a singular, authoritative hand, and the room shriveled into silence. Now, regarding the rumors that have dominated the news cycle, the claims made by Eleanor Sterling that I am pregnant. I paused, stretching the silence until it was brittle. until the air in the room felt thick enough to choke on. They are categorically, provably, and pathologically false. A murmur of genuine shock rippled through the press corps like a tidal wave. But the ultrasound, the doctor's records. A reporter shouted from the front row. His face twisted in disbelief. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I simply stepped back, a move as graceful as an executioner yielding to the blade, and let Declan take the podium. He didn't offer the audience a polite smile. His face was a mask of granite. He pressed a button, and an audio file tore through the auditorium's surround sound system, crisp and damning. Listen to me, doctor. Eleanor's voice, unmistakable and drenched in a cruel, sharp cadence, filled the space, turning the air cold. I don't care how you fake the sonogram. Just put her name on it and make it look 10 weeks along. The wire transfer for $500,000 will be in your Cayman account by noon. A moment passed, filled only by the static of the recording. Then the doctor's voice, thin, strained, and visibly trembling. Mrs. Sterling, this is medical fraud. I could lose my license. If you don't do it, you'll lose a lot more than your license, Eleanor snapped, the callousness of her tone chilling every person in that room. Once the media runs this, Sloan won't dare divorce Vance. The public backlash will force her to drop the lawsuits. Just print the damn photo. The audio cut out, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt deafening. The truth lay exposed, naked and hideous in the middle of the room. The faces of the journalists underwent a grotesque transformation, from the eager, saliva-dripping expressions of gossipmongers to the sharp, furious eyes of investigators. They realized, with a collective sting of betrayal, that they had been played as pawns in a felony fraud scheme. They were not the seekers of truth, they were the tools of a criminal. But Declan wasn't finished. Eleanor Sterling's actions constitute criminal fraud, extortion, and defamation, Declan stated, his voice booming like a gavel strike. The Manhattan District Attorney has already received this evidence, but the corruption of Sterling Apex runs far deeper than tabloids. Declan gestured toward the wings of the stage, and a small, solemn group of people walked into the light. They were older, their skin weathered by years of honest labor, wearing simple, worn clothes that seemed to carry the scent of the earth. They looked entirely out of place under the sterile, clinical glow of the studio lights. Yet they carried a profound, quiet dignity that made the glamorous reporters seem small and hollow. They were the Hudson Valley farmers and residents Declan's investigators had tracked down, the living, breathing evidence of the humanity Eleanor Sterling had tried to bury beneath her concrete vanity. One of the elderly men stepped forward, his knuckles calloused and his hands trembling slightly as he held a worn-out deed, a symbol of a heritage that had been nearly erased by the rapacious greed of a woman who thought she was untouchable. I watched them, feeling the weight of the moment, the final wall of my defense now fully fortified by the very people the Sterlings had discarded. As the camera lenses swiveled toward these silent witnesses, I knew that the era of Eleanor's reign was not just ending. It was being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece, under the blinding glare of the truth I had finally unleashed upon them all. Neighbors, those humble souls whose lives Richard Sterling had systematically dismantled 10 years prior. As they gathered center stage, the contrast was visceral. Their hands, calloused and mapped with the geography of hard labor, looked stark against the polished mahogany lectern. An elderly man, his spine curved like a weathered oak branch, leaned heavily on a polished cane as he stepped toward the microphone. His breath hitched, a fragile, rattling sound that amplified the tension in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ragged instrument of suppressed trauma, trembling with the weight of a decade spent in the shadows. He didn't just tell a story. He unspooled a nightmare. He described the clandestine terror campaign, the deliberate poisoning of their loyal dogs, the rhythmic, sickening sound of greenhouses being pulverized by heavy machinery, and the cold, calculated cruelty of fraudulent appraisals designed to hollow out their equity. He spoke of the legal siege, the endless predatory litigation that bled them dry until they were forced to surrender the soil that had nurtured their ancestors for generations. His eyes grew glassy as he recounted the death of his lifelong neighbor, a man whose heart simply shattered under the insurmountable pressure of the dispossession. In the cavernous silence of the auditorium, the sharp intake of breath from the press was audible. Reporters who had spent their careers chasing trivial society gossip now sat frozen, their cameras dangling forgotten at their sides, their faces softened by the raw, unvarnished humanity of the man's grief. This was no longer just a Manhattan scandal. It was a devastating, irrefutable indictment of a system designed to crush the small to embolden the powerful. I felt a surge of cold fire in my veins. Stepping forward, I bridged the distance between the privilege I had inhabited and the suffering they had endured. I wrapped a protective arm around the old man, anchoring him and by extension anchoring myself. I stand here today, I declared, my voice resonating with a clarity that shocked even me. Not as a victim of a bad marriage, but as an advocate for the real silent victims of this empire. Vanguard's new housing initiative is merely the first, faltering step in restoring the dignity that the Sterling systematically stole from you. Thank you. The fallout was truly apocalyptic. The moment those words hung in the air, they triggered a cascading chain reaction that effectively obliterated the Sterling dynasty. By 6 p.m. that evening, the city felt electrified by the sound of sirens as the FBI and NYPD launched a blitzkrieg of coordinated raids. I remained ensconced in the silence of my living room, watching the collapse of an era live on CNN. Federal agents, faceless and efficient, swarmed the gleaming fortress-like Sterling Apex headquarters in Midtown, dragging out plastic crates stuffed with the paper trail of a decade of crimes. Richard Sterling, the man who had styled himself the untouchable titan of the skyline, was captured in a grainy feed being led out of his Park Avenue penthouse in handcuffs. He looked remarkably small, his posture brittle, his eyes wide with a frantic animal terror. Eleanor met a different end. Arrested amidst the opulence of a Hamptons spa, she was a shrill, hysterical silhouette as she was shoved into the back of an unmarked cruiser, her perfectly coiffed hair, her armor against the world, now nothing more than a ruined, tangled mess. Even Vance, the heir to the Hollow Throne, was apprehended by federal marshals just as he attempted to board a private jet at Teterboro. He didn't offer a shred of resistance. The footage broadcast to the world showed him staring with vacant, dead eyes at the tarmac, a thoroughly broken man who had finally grasped the devastating reality that his father's vast, blood-stained fortune could not buy his way out of a federal indictment. The charges were, in a word, staggering. RICO violations, wire fraud, medical malpractice, extortion, and systemic conspiracy. By the following morning, Sterling Apex had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, dissolving like salt in a storm. In the quiet, hollowed-out weeks that followed, my life settled into a strange, haunting peace. The media's insatiable appetite moved on to fresher carcasses, leaving me in the stillness of my own recovery. I spent my days engrossed in architectural schematics for the Hudson Valley projects, taking long aimless walks through the budding greenery of Central Park, slowly learning how to draw a full breath again. One rainy Sunday afternoon, the sky a bruised purple, I found myself sorting through the forgotten detritus of my childhood bedroom. My fingers brushed against the rough surface of an old cedar chest, and as I pried it open, the scent of lavender and ancient dust washed over me. Inside lay the keepsakes of my late father, Arthur. He had been a man of precision and steel, a brilliant structural engineer whose life was snatched away in a tragic scaffolding collapse at a construction site when I was a mere 15. The official reports had called it a freak accident, a cruel roll of fate's dice. My mother had been shattered, and I, in my youthful naivety, had buried the jagged edges of that grief deep within the silent corners of my psyche. I pulled out a faded, sepia-toned Polaroid of my father, his face bright with an unburdened smile as he held me on his shoulders at a Mets game. As I stared at that youthful, hopeful expression, A jarring, terrifying dissonance shuddered through me. I remembered the weeks preceding his death. His agitation, the way he paced the hardwood floors until the small hours of the morning, the furious, clipped arguments he held on the phone regarding load-bearing stress and blatant criminal negligence. A cold, frantic urgency possessed me as I dug through the chest until my hands met the familiar, cracked leather of his sight journals. My heart hammered against my ribs as I flipped to the final entries from 15 years ago. The notes on the project he was managing, the specific contractor overseeing the site. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The holding company listed on the finalized site plans was a subsidiary of Sterling Apex. Back then, Richard Sterling was merely an up-and-coming developer, a man willing to trade human lives for an extra floor of profit. I clutched the journal to my chest and hurried downstairs, my boots thudding against the stairs. I thrust the book toward my mother, my fingers trembling as I pointed to the signature on the developer's contract. When her gaze fell upon the subsidiary name, the color didn't just drain from her face. It vanished, leaving her as white as a ghost. "Mom," I whispered, my voice thick with a burgeoning horrific truth, "Dad's accident. Was it a Sterling site?" She sat down slowly, her legs giving way as if she'd been struck, her hands clutching the journal with a grip that turned her knuckles ivory. "Yes," she breathed, her voice a hollow shell. "It was Richard's first major high-rise. Your father was the chief structural engineer. He was meticulous, Sloan. He never made mistakes. I never believed it was just an accident. But the city inspectors cleared the site in a day, and we had no proof, nothing but our grief. The sorrow I had buried for over a decade ignited in that instant, transforming from a heavy ache into a roaring, vengeful inferno. What if my father's death wasn't a tragedy? What if it was a murder? The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, a jagged blade cutting through the silence of the room. My mind reeled. If the collapse wasn't a structural failure, but a calculated execution, then my entire life, the poverty, the struggle, the haunting shadow of a father I barely knew, had been orchestrated by the same man who had groomed me to be his successor. I didn't tell Declan immediately. To involve him now would be to pull him into a vortex of darkness from which neither of us might return. I needed to see for myself. I needed to look the devil in the eye and watch his composure fracture. I arranged a visitor's pass to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a place where the air itself seemed to vibrate with the collective weight of broken lives. Vance was being held without bail, a caged predator waiting for the inevitable. The facility was bleak, a sprawling concrete tomb that smelled eternally of industrial bleach and the damp metallic tang of human despair. I sat down behind the thick, scratched plexiglass in the visitation room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When Vance walked in, led by a guard with an impassive face, he was a ghost of the man I once knew. He wore a coarse, oversized khaki prison jumpsuit that hung limply off his frame. He looked 10 years older, hollowed out, the arrogant veneer that once defined him scrubbed away to reveal something raw and pathetic underneath. He picked up the heavy black phone receiver with a tremor in his fingers. I mirrored his action, the plastic cool against my ear. "Did you come to gloat?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper of what it used to be. "You won, Sloan. You took everything." "I didn't come to gloat, Vance. I came to ask you a question about 15 years ago about my father, Arthur." His eyes darted away, a flicker of genuine primal panic crossing his face before he masked it behind a scowl. "I don't know what you're talking about." The site collapsed, I pressed, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "The one Richard built. My father was going to blow the whistle on your dad's cheap materials, wasn't he?" Vance stared at me, his chest heaving with a mixture of absolute despair and the crushing realization of his own obsolescence. He was facing decades in federal prison, and for the first time he seemed to acknowledge that he had nothing left to lose. Perhaps the rage he felt toward his father finally eclipsed his fear. He let out a hollow psychotic laugh that echoed off the sterile walls. An accident? You think my dad built a billion-dollar empire playing by the rules? You're naive, Sloan. He leaned close to the plexiglass, his hot, shallow breath fogging the barrier between us. My father doesn't just owe your family money. He owes you blood. Vance hung up the phone with a sharp click and turned his back, shuffling away toward his cell. I was left staring at the glass, seeing nothing but my own pale reflection. I left the prison, the cold, biting wind whipping off the East River, but it felt like a warm summer breeze compared to the icy realization settling in my gut. It was no longer a corporate vengeance plot. It was a homicide investigation hidden for 15 years. I immediately called Dinklin. When I brought him the journal, he listened with a grim, fixed expression before mobilizing his entire investigative team. Reopening a 15-year-old construction fatality was nearly impossible. The trails had grown cold, the evidence had long since been paved over by new developments, and the witnesses had either moved on or passed away. But we found a single persistent thread in my father's journal. He repeatedly mentioned a site foreman named Heron Graves. My dad wrote that Heron was a good man, but perpetually terrified of Richard Sterling's thugs. If we could find Heron Graves, we might find the truth. It took Declan's team 2 weeks, utilizing skip tracers and exhaustive tax records, to locate him. Heron had quit the industry the day after my father died, sold his house in Queens, and vanished into the Adirondack Mountains, living completely off the grid. Declan and I drove 4 hours north, the landscape shifting from urban sprawl to the deep, suffocating stillness of the woods. We found Heron's modest log cabin sitting by the edge of a frozen, silent lake. An old man with a thick, snow-white beard and skin weathered like ancient parchment was chopping firewood on the porch. When we approached and introduced ourselves, the color washed out of his face, leaving him as gray as the winter sky. At first, he refused to speak, citing his age and a crumbling memory, but the fear of Richard Sterling was still hardwired into his brain like a nervous reflex. I took out the faded Polaroid of my father and laid it on the rough wooden table. Mr. Graves, I am Arthur's daughter. I didn't come to punish you. I just want to know why my father didn't come home. For 15 years, my mother and I have lived with a ghost. Please give my dad peace, Declan added, his voice low and compassionate. Richard Sterling is in federal custody, Heron. He can't hurt you anymore, but we need your testimony to make sure he never sees daylight again. Heron looked at the photo, his hands trembling violently. He covered his face with his calloused palms and began to weep, the heavy, agonizing, body-racking sobs of a man who had carried a crushing weight of guilt for a decade and a half. He confessed everything. Heron explained that Richard Sterling had ordered the use of substandard, counterfeit steel for the main scaffolding, skimming millions to fuel his own expansion. My father, Arthur, had discovered the fraud, meticulously documenting every compromised weld and inferior beam. He had threatened to go straight to the Department of Buildings and the press, which would have systematically dismantled Richard's empire. The night before the accident, Heron saw Silas, Richard's primary fixer, and a crew of armed men tampering with the primary load-bearing joints on the scaffolding. Heron had been threatened with the lives of his wife and children if he ever spoke a word. The next morning my father went up for his inspection, his boots heavy with the weight of professional duty, unaware that the air he breathed would be his last. With a sickening metallic screech that tore through the morning silence, the rigging gave way instantly, gravity claiming its prize as the structure dissolved into a heap of twisted steel and splintered wood. The aftermath was a masterclass in calculated malice. Richard, cold and detached as a ledger entry, systematically paid off the corrupt safety inspectors who traded their morality for gold, and wired a massive blood-stained sum into an offshore account for Harlan, buying his silence and sentencing him to a lifetime of hiding in the shadows. I sat on the weathered porch of our home, staring out at the frozen lake, the biting wind mirroring the numbness spreading through my chest. Tears streamed down my face, not as a cleansing rain, but as hot stinging reminders of a theft beyond reckoning. My father, a man of uncompromising integrity who saw the world in shades of honor rather than profit, had been murdered like a common nuisance. With Harlan's sworn affidavit finally in our possession, a paper ghost resurrected after a decade of torment, Declan approached the U.S. Attorney's office with the precision of a surgeon. They secured a highly restricted search warrant for a secondary, off-the-books storage facility Richard had kept tucked away in a derelict corner of New Jersey. Buried deep behind a false wall, encased in a fireproof safe, the FBI unearthed the Holy Grail, Richard Sterling's personal ledger. It was more than a mere record of accounting. It was the manifesto of a paranoid king, an insurance policy designed to bury his accomplices should they ever falter. The pages detailed every nauseating bribe to inspectors, the wire transfer to Harlan, and a chilling clinical entry dated the very day my father died. The ink seemed to pulse with sociopathic indifference. Arthur wouldn't listen to reason, had clearly reached his threshold, so Silas handled the scaffolding, a tragic but necessary cost of doing business. One body paves the foundation. When Declan read that entry to me over the phone, my breath caught, but I didn't cry. Instead, a profound, chilling serenity washed over me. The monster, having spent 15 years cloaked in the veneer of respectability, was finally trapped in the blinding light of truth. The federal trial of Richard Sterling quickly ascended to become the media event of the decade. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was a cauldron of human emotion, packed with predatory reporters, the displaced and hollowed-out families of the Hudson Valley, and the metaphorical ghosts of every soul Richard had stepped over to reach his throne. My mother and I sat in the front row, a singular unit of grief and resilience. I wore a tailored black suit that felt like armor, my face an impenetrable mask forged from years of suppressed fury. Beside me, Declan sat as my legal counsel, his presence a steady, grounding anchor in a sea of turbulence. Richard Sterling looked like a hollowed-out corpse. The golden billionaire aura had rotted away, leaving behind only a frail, terrified old man in a coarse orange jumpsuit, his eyes darting frantically as if looking for an exit that no longer existed. Eleanor sobbed hysterically in the gallery, a performance of woe that convinced no one, while Vance sat motionless, refusing to make eye contact with the world he had helped dismantle. Faced with the ledger, Harlan's devastating testimony, and a mountain of financial fraud evidence that stretched to the ceiling, the defense's walls crumbled like the very scaffolding they had sabotaged. The judge's gavel struck like a thunderclap, signaling the end of an era. Richard Sterling was sentenced to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and fraud. Vance was handed 20 years for his role in the corporate extortion and offshore evasion, while Eleanor received 5 years for medical fraud and witness tampering. As the bailiffs led Richard away, his head bowed in defeat, the gallery erupted in a roar of applause, a collective release of a decade of held breath. My mother pulled me into a fierce, suffocating embrace, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated relief that finally broke the dam of my own composure. I looked up at the high, ornate ceiling of the courtroom, a silent vow passing between me and the ether, knowing my father could finally rest in the soil he had lived for. During the subsequent bankruptcy liquidation, Vanguard Holdings shocked the volatile veins of Wall Street by purchasing the entirety of Sterling Apex's assets. The pundits whispered that we would surely dissolve the company and scrub the stained name from the history books, yet I refused. I kept the Apex name for the new subsidiary, not as a badge of shame, but as a reclamation. I purged the entire suite of leadership, implemented ironclad ethical oversight, and transformed a monument of corporate sociopathy into an engine for community restoration. The name wasn't the crime. The men who wielded it were. My first act as the new head of Apex was to travel back to the Hudson Valley. We didn't just pour concrete for affordable housing. We performed an excavation of justice. We tracked down every family Sterling had displaced, every life he had unraveled. I sat in their modest living rooms, the smell of dust and memory in the air, and handed them newly drafted deeds. We sold them back their ancestral plots for exactly $1, accompanied by massive financial restitution packages drawn directly from the liquidated Sterling estates. When an elderly woman, Declan's grandmother's best friend, clutched the deed to her farm with trembling hands and wept with a joy that touched the sublime, I realized I had finally found my life's purpose. I had taken the very weapon used to annihilate my family and reforged it into a plowshare. Life eventually settled into a beautiful, productive rhythm. The Vanguard Apex housing initiatives flourished, turning ghosts of the past into vibrant homes. I felt infinitely lighter, unburdened by the crushing need to prove my worth to those who lacked the vision to see my soul. Throughout the long, arduous process, Declan remained my constant. He was my brilliant legal architect, my whispered confidant, and my partner in the delicate art of dismantling empires. We worked late nights over blueprints and legal briefs, the dim light of the office illuminating the path forward as we weaved together the intricate tapestry of our future. Our late nights were rarely defined by the sterile pressure of the courtroom. Instead, they were punctuated by the aromatic steam of takeout Chinese food, the gentle clatter of chopsticks against ceramic, and the sound of easy, unforced laughter that felt like a sanctuary. The trauma that had once sought to dismantle us had, in a paradoxical twist of fate, become the very mortar that bonded our souls together. It was our shared vision, a dream of restoration and grace, that rendered us inseparable. One particularly brisk autumn evening, the air crisp with the scent of dried leaves and incoming frost, Declan and I sought refuge from the city's hum within the sprawling embrace of Central Park. The maples and oaks had surrendered their green to a brilliant, feverish display of gold and crimson, casting long melancholic shadows across the pathways. High above, the city skyline glittered like spilled diamonds through the skeletal, bare branches of the trees. Everything was hushed, surrendered to a profound and heavy peace. As we neared the iconic curves of the Bow Bridge, Declan slowed, then stopped. He turned toward me, and the amber, honeyed light of a nearby lamp post caught in his eyes, turning them into liquid pools of sincerity. "Sloan," he began, his voice dropping into a register I had only ever reserved for our most intimate moments. "You know I have always admired you, even back at Colia." I felt a sudden, strange, and lovely flutter in my chest, a rhythm I hadn't known my heart was capable of keeping. "Really?" I teased, my voice barely a whisper. "You spent every waking hour buried beneath towers of tort law textbooks. I honestly thought you barely noticed I was there, let alone saw me." He let out a soft, self-deprecating laugh, stepping closer until the warmth of his presence eclipsed the autumn chill. "I noticed everything," he confessed, his gaze never wavering. "I was just a scholarship kid clawing for survival, and you were this brilliant, breathtaking force of nature. I never dared to imagine I'd have the right to stand beside you." He reached out, taking my hands in his grip firm, warm, and roughened by the honest work of our shared journey. "Sloan, walking through fire with you these past months has been the singular honor of my life. You are the strongest woman I have ever known. I realize now that what I feel transcends mere admiration or the solidarity of friendship. I love you, Sloan. I always have." The confession hit me not like a shock, but like the first light of dawn after a long, starless winter. After years of navigating the transactional affections and cold manipulations of my past, this love felt like oxygen, pure, protective, and rooted in a bedrock of mutual respect. I didn't need a single word to bridge the distance between us. I simply stepped into his arms, burying my face against the rough wool of his coat, finding solace in the steady, rhythmic drum of his heart, a heartbeat that promised it would never again be a source of betrayal. Years unfurled like pages in a well-loved book. The tempest that had once ravaged my existence had long since settled into a mere cautionary chapter in a textbook on corporate ethics. Then one quiet afternoon, the past knocked on my door in the form of a letter, its envelope bearing the stark, unmistakable stamp of the federal penitentiary system. The handwriting was Vance's. I sat at my desk, the paper cool against my fingertips, waiting for the old familiar spike of anxiety or the heat of righteous anger to flare. It never came. There was only a distant, clinical curiosity. I opened it, recognizing that this was the final lock to click shut. The letter was brief, the ink trembling on the page. He didn't beg, nor did he plead for a reduction in his sentence. Sloan, sitting in an 810 cell gives a man far too much time to reflect, he wrote. I see clearly now what a monster I became in my pathetic, frantic chase for my father's approval. I discarded the only real thing in my life. I hear you and Declan are married, and that the Hudson Project has become a beacon of success. I am genuinely glad. You always deserved a partner, not a parasite. I am paying my debt, and I know I deserve every grueling second of it. Do you remember our first date in Central Park? You dropped a tiny silver hairpin. I kept it in my pocket for years, foolishly thinking I had caught something beautiful, when in truth I was the one who crushed it. I am sorry. Be happy. I folded the letter with a steady hand and fed it into the paper shredder. I felt no lingering malice, only a soft, quiet pity for a man who had traded the integrity of his soul for the hollow shimmer of a facade. Forgiveness was not about offering him absolution. It was the realization that his memory had finally lost the power to quicken my pulse or haunt my dreams. On a bright, crystalline Sunday, Declan and I drove to the Hudson Valley to behold the completed community project. The once neglected orchards had been revitalized, lush and teeming with fruit, nestled alongside sustainable homes that looked as though they had sprouted from the earth itself. The air was filled with the music of children's laughter, dancing across the fields, while families wandered through a vibrant farmers' market in the town square. We walked hand in hand along the paved trails. The people we passed didn't look at us with the sycophantic, predatory fear of Manhattan socialites. They looked at us with genuine, glowing gratitude. In that moment, the truth crystallized. True power was not the ability to dismantle a rival at a gala, or the cold capacity to hoard millions in offshore shadows. True power was the quiet, transformative ability to take the shattered, jagged fragments of your own life and forge them into a shelter for others. Declan squeezed my hand, his eyes scanning the horizon of the community we had fought to save. What are you thinking about, Mrs. Hayes? I smiled, leaning my weight against his shoulder, feeling the solid, unshakable reality of the man beside me. I'm thinking that revenge is an exhausting, hollow pursuit, but building a life as beautiful as this? That is the only victory that matters. Of all, the atmosphere was crystalline, a sharp contrast to the suffocating, smog-choked memories of the city that had once held us captive in its iron grip. We stood there together under the clear upstate sky, a vast canopy of twilight blue that seemed to stretch into eternity, washing away the bitter residue of our former battles. I felt the weight of every calculated scheme and every sleepless night dissolve into the cool evening air. The ghosts of the past, those haunting apparitions of betrayal and hollow ambition, no longer possessed the power to pull at my hem. They were mere shadows retreating into the periphery of a life finally reclaimed. My pulse, once erratic with the rhythm of survival and defense, now beat in a steady, tranquil syncopation with the earth beneath our feet. Declan's presence was a grounding force, a silent promise etched into the quietude of our sanctuary. We were not merely standing in a landscape. We were witnessing the dawn of a narrative we had written with our own resilience. Every inhale felt like a cleansing, an invitation to exist without the armor I had worn for far too long. With my heart unburdened and my spirit finally tethered to a purpose greater than retribution, I looked toward the horizon, ready for whatever the future held.